So, hello everyone. As part of our celebration of recovery and resilience in the education youth sector, we're privileged to be joined by Professor John Hattie to discuss exactly that issue. Now, Professor Hattie is someone who doesn't really need much introduction, but for anyone who's not in the know, John Hattie is Professor of Education and Director of the Melbourne Education Research Institute. He's the author of the legendary book Visible Learning, a magisterial analysis of hundreds of educational meta-analyses to present the evidence on what teaching strategies are effective at improving pupil outcomes. With successive updates and additions, it remains the gold standard in rigorous but practical guidance for high quality teaching. Professor Hattie has recently written a brilliant report, An Ode to Expertise, which surveys the evidence on how schools responded to the pandemic and what this tells us about the best way forward for educational policy and practice. Professor Hattie, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Baz.
Professor Hattie, in your fantastic new briefing, An Ode to Expertise, you analyse the international evidence on the impact of the pandemic on young people's learning, mental health, and social and emotional learning outcomes. What did you find?
Well, believe it or not, there are 4 meta-analyses already on the effect of COVID and the lockdowns and the distance learning and all the kinds of hybrids that happened on student achievement. And they all claim to be first, and they all claim, and they indeed all use quite different articles. There's about 15 million students in the samples across the 4 studies. And when you look at the average effect, it's about minus 0.15, which on the scale of effect sizes is pretty tiny. And given, Baz, there was death, unemployment, equity issues, resource issues, you got to stop and say, how come the effect was so small? And the argument I make in the paper is that it was the expertise of the teachers. They made sure that learning didn't stop. They went out of their way to find ways to be effective online. They worried about students right across the spectrum. And whilst it's still a bit early to say whether the effects on different kinds of students may be different, there's no meta-analyses yet on the social and emotional learning, but even so, the overall effect on achievement pretty tiny. Like one major study that's within that is a study out of New Zealand where they compared the 2 COVID years with the previous 10 years. Reading, no difference. Maths, it actually went up a tiny bit. And writing, it went down substantially, mainly because writing, we stopped teaching it. And so the reason I called it that title, and I'm very proud of that title, is that we really do have to stop and pause and say, what did teachers do so well? And how come we don't give them a lot more credit and esteem for what they did and what turned out surely to be an incredible difficult time?
And there's a brilliant bit in your briefing where you touch upon exactly this point, Professor Hattie, where you say, contrary to expectations, forecasters, and purveyors of doom, there were remarkable levels of resilience, coping strategies, and expertise that minimized the harm, indeed added very high levels of value-added growth during COVID teaching. Can you say a bit more about the resilience and brilliance we saw in the education sector during the pandemic?
Yeah, it does attest a lot to what teachers did and their resilience. Plus, it attests a lot to what students did. And I think the biggest travesty of COVID is that we learned nothing and rushed back to the old normal. Like, don't get me wrong, Baz, it was an overall negative effect. I'm not advocating that we should go to distance learning as we experience it, even though I know some countries like Singapore, it's now compulsory once a fortnight that students learn via distance at school for lots of good reasons. And I think that it's well worth every school pausing and saying, what went well during COVID? What went well in the regular school and vice versa? What didn't do well? And like in the regular class, I know from my wife actually did a study of 20,000 teachers in your country, in fact, where she and you are both from, mainly up near the Birmingham area. And across those 20,000 classes, teachers talk 89% of the time. They ask 150 questions a day that require 3-word answers. You couldn't do that on Zoom. You had to stop talking. You had to go into triage and work out where you put your priorities. Teachers used things like Oak Academy to get students to watch lessons whilst they spent their time teaching. Teachers had to give up control of the classroom in many ways. And some students, for the first time, many of them had to learn how to teach themselves. Like take gifted students. The stunning finding from gifted students is the majority of gifted students do not become gifted adults. They become very, very dependent on their teachers. Teachers had to give up gradual release of responsibility, and sometimes it was very speedy. We saw the amazing effect of social media, where students were more likely to talk through social media about what they didn't understand and they didn't know to their peers and to the teacher that they won't do when the teacher's standing beside them. We saw more teachers and school leaders collectively working together. We saw more students being taught how to work alone, how to work with others. And I thought we saw a lot more about engagement. It was a lot more than doing. And I think the other point I'd pause on Baz, is teachers learn to cover less and go deeper. And like, you know what it's like in your country and mine. We fiddle with the curriculum every few years. We set up a committee to get rid of stuff out of the committee, and what do they do? They add more and more and more and more. It's bonkers how broad it is. You couldn't cover a mile wide, an inch deep. So I think we learned a lot about COVID, and I think teachers were quite remarkable. I look forward to the day when someone does a meta-analysis on the social and emotional aspects of learning. Like, I've tracked back over the last 15 years to show that anxiety and depressed majorly affect about 8-9% of our students. That didn't change in COVID. If anything, it went down slightly. We know well-being went down slightly during COVID, but it snapped back to what it was the day the kids come back to school. We know that the biggest effect on students is they miss their friends. They didn't miss us, they missed their friends. And so I think there's a lot that we can show that what happened there. Now, again, I don't want to paint the picture as if it's all rosy. There were problems. It was a negative effect. But my argument is that we should stop and give credit to the teachers to say that they actually prevented a incredible disaster. And I think that the snapback is going to be pretty quick. The effect size of COVID is about the same effect of what students lose over the summer. And we know teachers are pretty good at snapping back there. So yes, I don't think it was as bad as we thought it was, and we have a lot to learn.
And so one of the themes of our event, Professor Hattie, is, of course, resilience, but also recovery. And I take it from what you're saying that you don't see the need for a large impetus of educational intervention, both at a policy and practice level, in order to recover pupils. Instead, see the focus here to be more about learning what we can in the long term from the pandemic period.
Well, yes and no. I think that what we did in COVID, certainly I know in Australia, we spent a lot of resources on small group coaching. Unfortunately, that sucked out of the system a lot of relief and substitute teachers, which we desperately need, and we're missing them now in our teacher shortage more than anything. They're about 15% of our workforce. And I think that the learning from that, being it was very positive, is something that we can continue as part of the recovery. I think that the problem I see is that we didn't learn enough, and we're going back to our old ways of doing things, and we're not using some of those coaching methods that we saw were quite effective. We're not using the narrowing the curriculum and going deeper. We're not using teachers stopping being performers and starting being active agents of change. And so I think we can learn a lot from it to increase. I just worry that if we do go back, a lot of the kids who were not ones that succeeded in the previous school will still not succeed. So I think we've made pretty good recovery. There's still ways to go, but I think that urgency, that acceleration is something that we should maintain.
And that brings us very neatly onto our final question, Professor Hattie, which is an opportunity for you to lay out your vision here on what does all the evidence on teaching and learning over COVID tell us about how England can support more effective teaching and learning moving forward?
Well, you mentioned my Visible Learning book of 2008, 2009. I just released a new version, the sequel, about 2 weeks ago, trying to spend a lot more time looking at teaching methods, looking at learning, looking at the things that really made the difference. And I introduced this model of instructional alignment, where we have to know where the students are in terms of learning the knowledge, the precious knowledge and the content, where they need to be, and the different kinds of methods and strategy when we want to consolidate that knowledge, when we want to get them into the problem-solving mode, when we want to do transfer. I think we need to be a lot smarter to get away from our usual debates of either or, either it's direct instruction or it's problem-based. It's about when we use the right methods. I think the same as we learned in COVID, we were very, very quick to learn that there was a right time to use certain kinds of interventions and wrong times. I think we found ways to support some of our students who struggle on the regular schooling. during COVID. I think we can come back and do that. But the one I want to particularly pick up, Baz, is that during COVID, teachers talked to other teachers about teaching and their impact of their teaching much, much more than they do in the regular school. Principals, school leaders, talk to other school leaders. What's working for you? What's not working? Do you allow the students to turn the video on or off? What happens if they don't turn up? We had an incredible amount of the profession. And one of the things that I've noted in almost every country in the world that I've ever looked at, I have not seen yet a single policy that's come down from the government, from the superintendent, from the system to the school to tell them how to teach well during COVID. Surely COVID was the biggest teacher-led, educator-led revolution we've ever seen. And my message is that we need to learn from that. We need to help our school leaders become smarter at building policy, not just critiquing it, but building policy, not just for them, but for the system. And working from that middle up. We've had far too much policy from down. We need to have a lot more policy from up to balance that. And I think if we can learn from that during COVID, we'll be a much better education system.
Professor John Hattie, thank you so much for your time and taking us through a note of expertise, a brilliant read that I'd really strongly recommend to everyone.